The day was like any other in the city, filled with the usual rush of people going about their business. Cars honked, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the streets. It was an ordinary afternoon, yet it would soon turn into something unforgettable. Among the busy crowd, a black man walked with purpose, unaware that his life was about to change in a matter of minutes. This man, tall and confident, had recently received an incredible promotion. After years of dedication, hard work, and overcoming obstacles, he had earned the title of captain at the local police department. The announcement had made waves, an achievement that was inspiring to many. But that day, as he walked down the street, his thoughts weren't on his new position. He was just focused on the usual errands, nothing extraordinary, just the routine. On the opposite side of the street, a police officer, Officer Taylor, was on patrol. Officer Taylor had a reputation in the department, but it wasn't a good one. His views were well known, often leaning towards prejudice, especially when it came to black people. He had made a name for himself with his harsh and sometimes misguided approach. However, none of his colleagues dared to challenge his behavior, leaving him to believe his actions went unnoticed. As Officer Taylor walked along the street, his eyes caught sight of the black man ahead. In his mind, a story was already forming. His assumptions were quick, and without giving it much thought, he decided this man was someone he needed to confront. He crossed the street, closing the distance between them with determination in his steps. The black man, on the other hand, noticed the officer approaching but thought nothing of it. He was used to being stopped by police occasionally. It was part of life. Little did he know that this encounter would be like no other. Officer Taylor's eyes narrowed as he came up to the man, a mix of suspicion and arrogance in his gaze. Without any greeting, without any clear reason, the officer raised his voice. "Hey, you! Stop right there," Officer Taylor commanded, his tone sharp. The black man paused, confused but not angry. He had been stopped by cops before for no reason, so this didn't faze him. He knew the drill, just another run-in with an officer who probably thought he was up to something. But this time, something felt different. The officer was speaking to him in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. His mind was still processing the situation when the officer took it a step further, accusing him of something he hadn't done. "What's your business here?" Officer Taylor snapped, not waiting for a response. His eyes moved over the black man as if he were inspecting him, a look that seemed to judge him for no reason at all. The black man, now beginning to feel the weight of the situation, kept calm. He knew it was better not to escalate things. "I'm just walking. I haven't done anything wrong," he replied, his voice steady, though inside, he was starting to feel frustrated. But Officer Taylor wasn't listening. His judgment was clouded by something far more dangerous than just suspicion. It was his ingrained bias, the automatic assumption that because of the man's skin color, he must be doing something wrong. In an instant, the officer's patience snapped. Without warning, he threw a punch, landing it squarely on the black man's face. The crowd around them gasped, some frozen in shock, others pulling out their phones to record. The black man staggered back from the blow, his face stinging. He hadn't expected this, but instead of reacting with anger or violence, he stood still, his mind quickly processing what had just happened. Why had the officer attacked him without cause? The world around him seemed to blur for a moment, but the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Officer Taylor stood there, his hand still raised as he looked at the man, not realizing the full magnitude of the situation. The punch had been thrown, but the world seemed to slow down in that moment. The black man stood still, trying to collect his thoughts as the sting from the officer's punch began to throb on his face. His eyes briefly closed, and he took a deep breath, the usual mix of frustration and anger bubbling inside him. But he didn't react impulsively. Instead, he remained calm, his posture unshaken, though his mind was racing. What had just happened? Why had the officer done that? The people around them, who had been milling about, were now watching the scene unfold in disbelief. Some of them had pulled out their phones, recording the incident, while others were frozen, unsure of how to react. The black man looked at the officer, who still stood there, seemingly unsure of his next move. The tension in the air was thick. Despite the officer's unjustified action, the black man didn't immediately escalate the situation. Instead, he looked around the crowd, hoping to gauge the reactions of the people nearby. Some were whispering, some were shaking their heads. It wasn't a scene he was unfamiliar with. Encounters like this, where assumptions were made based on race, were something he had faced far too often in his life. But today, it felt different. There was something about this encounter that made him feel as if it could go beyond the usual exchange of words and accusations. He wasn't just a random person on the street. He was the new captain at the police department. Still, it was hard to believe the officer, the one who had just struck him, would know who he was. The black man wasn't wearing the uniform, and he wasn't carrying anything that would suggest his position. To the officer, he was just another black man to challenge. But the reality was far different. The black man was about to show this officer that appearances could be deceiving. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stood up straighter, meeting the officer's gaze with a sense of authority. "You really think you can just hit someone because of the way they look?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The officer stared at him, momentarily thrown off by the lack of fear in the man's eyes. He had expected resistance, perhaps anger, but instead, the black man was simply standing there, looking at him with a calmness that almost made the officer feel uncomfortable. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Officer Taylor finally managed to say, his tone defensive, trying to regain some of his earlier bravado. The black man, though, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, maintaining his calm, refusing to be provoked. "It doesn't matter who I am, officer. What matters is that you have no reason to treat anyone like this," he said, each word measured and calm. The officer was beginning to realize something wasn't right, but he wasn't quite there yet. The black man continued to hold his ground, knowing full well that this was no longer just an argument between two people. It was about power, authority, and how deeply ingrained biases could influence someone's actions. He knew that if he handled this poorly, the consequences could affect more than just him, but there was no turning back now. At that moment, a senior officer, Captain Hayes, arrived at the scene, sensing something was wrong. He had heard the commotion from a distance and immediately recognized the situation could escalate quickly. As he walked toward them, his eyes scanned the scene, noticing the tense interaction between the two officers. His gaze locked on the black man who had been punched, and his face changed immediately. He had seen that face before. "Hold on a minute, Taylor," Captain Hayes called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Both the black man and the officer turned to him, but the officer's confusion only deepened. The captain looked at the man who had been struck. Recognition slowly dawned on his face. The black man wasn't just anyone. He was the new captain, the one whose promotion had been the talk of the department for weeks. The officer's face shifted from surprise to dread as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had just punched his own superior officer without even realizing who he was. As Captain Hayes approached, the atmosphere shifted. His presence commanded attention, and there was no mistaking the seriousness of his tone when he addressed Officer Taylor. The officer, still standing frozen in disbelief, barely managed to comprehend what was happening. He had acted impulsively, driven by assumptions and prejudice, without ever taking a moment to consider who the man before him was. The black man stood there, his hand lightly resting on his jaw where the punch had landed. He felt the sting, but he was more concerned with the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. This was a moment that could change the course of many things within the department. As Captain Hayes looked at the black man, something clicked. The recognition on the senior officer's face was undeniable. Hayes turned his gaze from the officer to the man who had been struck. His eyes softened, and his expression shifted from that of a commander to one of respect and recognition. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice now calm and understanding. The words were for the black man, the newly appointed captain of the force. The officer, still trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened, blinked in disbelief. He tried to find words, but they were stuck in his throat. The reality of his actions began to hit him hard. He was standing before a man he had just assaulted, his superior officer. And not just any officer, but the man who had risen through the ranks to become the department's new captain. Captain Hayes took a step forward, his voice now directed toward Officer Taylor, who had yet to fully grasp the situation. "Taylor, step aside," Hayes said, his authority undeniable. Officer Taylor seemed to snap out of his daze, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The black man, though, didn't focus on the officer's mistake. He turned to Captain Hayes with a calm but firm expression. "I'm not looking for a confrontation, sir. But this is bigger than one officer's mistake. This is about how people are treated, how assumptions are made, without any reason, based on the color of someone's skin. This can't keep happening." Captain Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. He had been aware of the challenges within the department, but this moment brought it all to the surface. It wasn't just about the incident. It was about a culture that needed to change. The black man, though still calm, had made a powerful point. The officer's racist assumptions had led to the violence, and now it was clear that there was no easy way out for anyone involved. The scene had attracted attention from the crowd, and whispers rippled through the bystanders. Some took out their phones to capture the moment, but there was no mistaking the gravity of the situation. The black man, now revealed to be the new captain, held his ground with remarkable composure, understanding that the conversation was shifting from a personal encounter to a larger issue. He addressed the officer one more time, his tone firm but measured. "You don't know me, and you made assumptions. That's what needs to change. Not just here, but everywhere." Captain Hayes, standing beside the black man, now fully understood the situation. The senior officer's face betrayed a deep sense of regret as he watched the younger man stand tall, facing this moment with remarkable dignity. It wasn't just a moment of tension. It was a turning point, a chance for the department to reckon with its deeper issues. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, took a step back. He knew he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but for now, he was left speechless. The black man, still in control of the situation, addressed the bystanders, his voice carrying, "This isn't about me. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. We all have to do better." The crowd, once uncertain, now understood the importance of this encounter. The black man wasn't just a victim in this moment. He was an embodiment of change, of what was possible when one stood up against injustice. Captain Hayes finally broke the silence, turning to Officer Taylor with a firm look. "We'll handle this. Get yourself together, Taylor. We'll talk later." As Hayes spoke, the air felt heavier. But in that moment, it also felt like something could change. The seeds of a much-needed conversation were planted, and perhaps, just maybe, this was the first step toward real change within the department. The realization of what had just happened weighed heavily on Officer Taylor's mind. As Captain Hayes turned his attention to the black man, the newly appointed captain who had been wrongfully struck, the officer's thoughts raced. He stood there, frozen, his mouth slightly open as if searching for the right words but finding none. The quiet tension was thick in the air as Hayes took charge of the situation, now fully aware of the gravity of what had unfolded. The black man, the new captain, didn't look angry. There was no trace of hostility in his expression. Instead, he simply held his head high, exuding a calm authority that seemed to fill the space around him. He didn't need to shout or demand attention. His presence spoke volumes. The officer, still processing what had just occurred, took a step back, his face pale with disbelief. Captain Hayes turned to the officer, his tone no longer one of authority, but one of clear disappointment. "Taylor, do you even realize what you've done?" Hayes' voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of years of experience, of someone who had seen countless situations like this. It was a question, but it didn't seem to need an answer. The officer already knew what he had done was wrong, and now the realization was sinking in deeper. The black man, who had taken the punch without retaliating, slowly turned to face the officer. "You didn't even stop to think, did you?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. "I understand people make mistakes, but there's no excuse for this kind of behavior. Not here. Not now." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had assumed so much about this man. Without giving him a second thought, he had let his bias take control. He hadn't even noticed the calm authority in the man's demeanor, nor did he recognize the possibility that he might be someone important. All of that was irrelevant in the officer's mind, clouded by assumptions that the black man before him was just another person to be treated with suspicion. The black man's gaze didn't waver. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me, but you decided to act on your prejudices anyway," he said. The officer felt a deep sense of regret wash over him, but it was too late to take back what had already happened. The damage had been done. Captain Hayes watched the interaction closely, his eyes flicking between the officer and the black man who had been assaulted. It was clear to Hayes that this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about something much deeper, a flaw within the system that allowed biases like this to go unchecked. The officer wasn't just guilty of punching the man. He had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment, and that was far more dangerous than any physical altercation. Hayes turned back to the black man, who was still standing tall despite the incident. "I apologize, sir," Hayes said, his voice softer than before, though still carrying the authority of his position. "I can't undo what happened, but I will make sure this is addressed. We will handle this." The officer, who had been silently standing at attention, looked over at the black man with a mix of shame and regret. I'm sorry," he stammered, though the apology felt hollow. It wasn't enough to make up for his actions, and he knew that. His attempt at an apology was just a small step, one that would not erase the wrong he had done. The black man nodded, acknowledging the apology, but it was clear that the damage ran deeper than just the physical blow. This was about the larger issue, the systemic prejudices that continued to exist in the department. The black man had not come here to be a victim. He had come here to lead, to be a part of a change that would challenge the status quo and create a better environment for everyone. "I don't need your apology," he said, his voice steady. "What I need is for you to understand that this kind of behavior can't continue. Not from you. Not from anyone." The officer stood there, now completely aware of the seriousness of the situation. He understood now that he wasn't just facing consequences for a punch. He was facing the consequences of a mindset that had been allowed to persist for too long. As Captain Hayes motioned for the officer to follow him, the black man took a deep breath, knowing that this moment, though difficult, was just the beginning. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And today, in this street corner confrontation, it was starting with him. The air was thick with tension as Officer Taylor, still processing the gravity of his actions, followed Captain Hayes to the side. The black man, the new captain, remained where he stood, his calm composure unwavering despite the overwhelming circumstances. He had expected something like this to happen, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the moment when he'd be forced to confront not just an officer's mistake, but an entire system that had allowed such biases to persist for so long. As Captain Hayes and Officer Taylor moved a few steps away from the crowd, the black man remained rooted to the spot, his eyes focused ahead. He felt a deep sense of disappointment, not just in the officer, but in the entire system he had just joined. He had hoped that with his promotion, things would begin to change. He had hoped that he could inspire others, bring real change to the department, and help create an environment where prejudice had no place. But standing here now, he realized that change wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't come overnight. Captain Hayes glanced back at the black man, noticing the man's steady resolve. "I can't imagine how you must be feeling right now," Hayes said quietly, his voice sincere. But I need you to know, we're going to take care of this." The black man nodded, his face set in a determined expression. "I'm not looking for sympathy," he replied calmly. "What I need is for this department to do better. For us to do better. This isn't just about one officer's mistake. It's about everything. The way people are treated. The way we let things slide because we're too afraid to confront them." Captain Hayes paused, the weight of the conversation sinking in. He had always known that the police force had its flaws, but hearing it spoken so openly, so honestly, was a wake-up call. He had witnessed things that were wrong before, but had always been too focused on maintaining order and keeping peace. This was a moment of reckoning, a moment when the old ways of doing things could no longer be ignored. "I agree with you," Hayes said after a long pause. "This is bigger than one mistake. It's about the culture of this department, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We've failed in many ways, but it's not too late. We can make this right. Together." The black man took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the officer who stood quietly in the background, waiting for further instructions. He could feel the officer's remorse, but it wasn't enough. Remorse without action meant nothing. He needed to see change, real change. The officer, standing with his shoulders slumped, finally spoke. I never meant to hurt anyone," he stammered. "I made a mistake and I know it now. I don't know what I was thinking." The black man looked at him, his eyes piercing through the officer's apology. "I don't think you do know what you were thinking," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You didn't stop to think about who I was. You didn't stop to think about how your actions could have destroyed someone else's life. This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who's ever been judged because of their skin color. People like me have to fight to be seen as human, and that fight shouldn't be ours to fight alone." The officer lowered his head, ashamed of the words that he had just heard. He had never truly understood the depth of his actions until now, and the realization hit him harder than any reprimand could have. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. He had to change, not just as an officer, but as a person. And that change had to start now. Captain Hayes stepped forward, his tone now more commanding. "Taylor, we're going to make this right. There's going to be an investigation, and we'll review everything that's happened. But you're not getting off easy. You'll face the consequences for your actions. But more importantly, you'll learn. We'll all learn from this." The black man turned away from them, his mind heavy with the knowledge that this moment, though small, was a crucial step toward something bigger. He knew it wasn't over. The fight was just beginning. But today, he had stood his ground. And that alone was a victory. He took another deep breath, ready for whatever was to come. Change wasn't going to happen easily, but it was happening, one step at a time. The tension in the air was palpable as the black man, the new captain, stood silently, his thoughts deep. He had been calm during the entire confrontation, but now that it was over, his mind was racing. The officer's apology, though sincere, didn't change the fact that an injustice had been done. The black man knew that in this moment, a larger issue had been exposed, not just the officer's actions, but the larger problem of bias and systemic inequality that ran through the department and beyond. He took a step forward, his posture straight and strong, and faced Captain Hayes. "I appreciate the apology, but it's not just about what happened today," he said. His voice was steady, his words measured. "This is about a culture that has allowed this kind of thing to happen for too long. It's about how people are treated, how assumptions are made based on skin color, not character." Captain Hayes, who had been listening intently, nodded in agreement. He had always known that there were flaws within the system, but hearing the black man speak so clearly about the reality of his experience made it impossible to ignore any longer. Hayes felt a pang of guilt in his chest, realizing that he had overlooked these issues for far too long. He had been a part of the problem by not challenging it sooner. "I know," Hayes said, his voice low. "I know this isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that has failed too many people. And it's about time that we change that. The black man looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. He had heard empty promises before, seen leaders make statements without action, and he wasn't interested in hearing more of the same. He needed to know that this time, things would be different. "I don't want promises," he replied. "I want to see change. Real change. I don't want to have to stand here again, years from now, facing another officer who thinks they can get away with this kind of behavior. We need to build a department where people are held accountable, where no one is above the law, no matter their rank, their race, or their background." Captain Hayes listened closely, feeling the weight of the words. He had been in law enforcement for years, and he had seen all too often how officers could get away with mistakes, how misconduct could be swept under the rug. But hearing the new captain speak, hearing the raw honesty in his voice, made Hayes realize that things had to change, starting now. "You're right," Hayes said, his voice firm. "We can't just talk about change. We need action. And that starts today. I'll make sure this is addressed. I'll make sure that every officer knows that we are committed to making this department a place of fairness, not one of bias and prejudice." The black man gave a small nod, accepting the words, but he wasn't fully convinced. He had seen too many good intentions fall flat before. "Action speaks louder than words," he said. "I'll be watching. We all will. And I won't back down until I see a department that reflects the values of equality and justice that we all claim to uphold." Captain Hayes knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with obstacles. But he also knew that this moment had to be the turning point. They had to confront the issues head-on, no more avoiding the difficult conversations or brushing problems under the rug. This was an opportunity to make real change, to reshape the department into something better. Officer Taylor, who had been standing silently off to the side, couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation. The earlier apology he had offered now seemed empty in comparison to what was being discussed. He had heard the new captain's words, and they stung. He knew he had failed in the most basic way, but that failure wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of a much bigger issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. "I'll make it right," Officer Taylor said quietly, his voice low but sincere. "I'll do whatever it takes." The black man didn't respond immediately, but the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes was enough. He knew that words, while important, were only the first step. The real test would be in what came next, the actions that followed, the commitment to change that would be shown in the days, months, and years ahead. With a deep breath, he turned to Captain Hayes. "We have a lot of work to do, don't we?" Hayes met his gaze, his own resolve hardening. "Yes, and we'll start now." The new captain felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And that, for now, was enough. Change would come, but it would take time, effort, and a commitment to never stop pushing for progress. The weight of the situation hung over the department like a dark cloud, but the black man, now firmly established as the new captain, was determined to turn this moment into a catalyst for change. He knew that if this incident was to mean anything, it couldn't just be swept under the rug. It couldn't be one of those situations where people said the right things in the moment, but didn't follow through when it mattered most. He had to act, and he had to make sure others did too. Captain Hayes had promised change, but words alone would never be enough. The black man knew that the promise had to be backed up by action, something tangible that everyone in the department could see. The only way forward was to create a system that was accountable to everyone, officers, citizens, and leaders alike. But getting there wouldn't be easy. Over the next few days, the new captain began to work closely with Hayes to address the problem at the heart of the department. They called for an internal meeting with all the officers, a chance to lay the groundwork for what was to come. The room was filled with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Many officers had been part of the old system, where biases were often ignored or dismissed. The black man could feel the unease in the air, but he didn't back down. He had a message to deliver, and it was one that they needed to hear. As he stood in front of the officers, the room went silent. Every eye was on him. He was aware of the pressure, the weight of the moment, but he had made his decision. He wasn't going to hold back. "I know that change is hard," he began, his voice steady and strong. "But if we are going to move forward as a department, we must first acknowledge where we've gone wrong. We've failed in a lot of ways, and this," he paused, letting the words sink in. "This is just one example of the damage that's been done." He could feel the tension in the room, but he continued. "I've seen too many officers get away with mistakes because they weren't held accountable. It's time for that to stop. We will have to face hard truths about the way we've been operating. There's no room for bias. There's no room for assumptions based on race, background, or anything else. We need to become a department that earns the trust of every person we serve, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room was quiet. The officers sat, listening intently, but some faces still carried doubt. The black man knew that words alone wouldn't change the culture overnight. There was going to be resistance, and he would have to fight for every bit of progress. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this. Captain Hayes was right beside him, and there were other officers who shared his vision of a better future for the department. "We're going to be holding each other accountable," the new captain continued. "We're going to create training programs that address bias and improve our communication with the community. We're going to be transparent in everything we do, and we're going to build trust, not just in our department, but in the people we serve." It was a bold statement, and the black man could sense the mixed reactions from the officers. Some were listening intently, while others seemed to be quietly resisting the changes. But that was expected. The road to change was always filled with obstacles. He couldn't expect everyone to agree with him immediately, but that wouldn't stop him from pushing forward. "We'll be making changes starting today. Every officer will be required to attend mandatory training on racial bias. We'll be re-evaluating our policies and procedures to make sure we're not just paying lip service to the idea of equality. We're living it," he said. There was a long pause in the room, and then, to his surprise, a few officers nodded in agreement. Some even spoke up, acknowledging the need for change. It wasn't a unanimous shift, but it was a start. The black man knew it was only the beginning of a long process. The work would be hard, and there would be setbacks, but he was willing to put in the effort. As the meeting ended, the new captain made it clear that he would be watching closely, not to catch anyone in the act of failure, but to make sure that everyone was given the tools and support they needed to succeed in creating a better, more just department. He stepped out of the room, feeling a sense of resolve settle in his chest. Change wasn't going to happen in one day, but today was the first step, and that was something to hold on to. The days following the meeting were filled with a whirlwind of activity. The black man, now fully immersed in his role as captain, could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every decision he made would matter, every action would be scrutinized, and he had no intention of letting this opportunity slip by. He was determined to prove that real change was possible, that his leadership could make a difference in a department that had long struggled with its biases. The first step was to implement the training programs he had promised. He worked closely with Captain Hayes and other officers to design a series of workshops on racial bias, cultural sensitivity, and community engagement. They'd brought in experts from outside the department, people who had experience in breaking down prejudices and rebuilding trust. It wasn't just about teaching officers what they should or shouldn't do. It was about helping them understand why their actions mattered and how deeply their behavior affected the people they served. The new captain knew that true transformation couldn't happen with just a few classes. It was about creating a culture of openness, where officers could have honest conversations about their own biases and misconceptions, where they could learn from each other and grow. But the road to change was never a smooth one. The resistance was subtle but constant. There were still some officers who resented the changes, who felt threatened by the new direction the department was taking. They'd been used to the old ways, to the comfort of their prejudices going unchecked. Now, They were being asked to confront those biases head-on. But the black man wasn't discouraged. He continued to lead with integrity and patience. He knew that it would take time for the department to truly shift its mindset, but he was willing to wait. The most important thing was to keep pushing forward, even when it felt like nothing was changing. He held individual meetings with officers, giving them the chance to speak freely, to voice their concerns, and to share their experiences. It was in these private conversations that real progress began to take root. When officers were able to speak openly about their fears and doubts, it created space for empathy and understanding. Slowly but surely, walls began to crumble. Outside the department, the community began to notice the difference. People were cautiously optimistic. There had been too many broken promises before, too many incidents of injustice that had been brushed aside. But now, there was something different. The captain had made it clear that the department was no longer going to hide from its flaws. They were going to confront them head-on. Officers began to engage more with the community, attending neighborhood meetings and participating in outreach programs. The black man made sure that officers weren't just patrolling the streets. They were becoming a part of the communities they served. They were there to listen, to build relationships, and to show that they were there for the right reasons. It wasn't perfect. There were still bumps along the way. There were still moments of tension, moments when old habits threatened to resurface. But the black man stayed focused, keeping the department on track. He knew that real change wasn't about eliminating every problem in one fell swoop. It was about creating an environment where progress could be made, where the work of building trust would never stop. Months passed, and as the new captain walked through the precinct, he noticed something different. There was a subtle shift in the way officers interacted with each other, in the way they spoke about the people they were sworn to protect. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. The captain's leadership had sparked something that couldn't be undone. The department was beginning to heal, beginning to evolve. One evening, as the black man sat in his office, reviewing reports, Captain Hayes walked in with a smile. "You're doing it," Hayes said, his voice filled with pride. "I see it. The change is happening." The captain looked up, his expression serious but hopeful. "It's just the beginning," he said, "but we're on the right path." He knew that the work was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Change was possible, and it had already begun, and he would continue to lead the way, one step at a time.